Long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined by the professor of law at Chase Law School, Ken Katkin. Ken, welcome to The Politics Guys.
It is always great to be back.
Ken, I just have to ask, this week is weird in the sense of the presidency. I mean, have you ever gone missing from your job?
Well, as a professor, I get to go missing from my job for the 3 or 4 day interval that Secretary Austin didn't show up. I frequently might not show up for a 3 or 4 day interval.
Leave it to you privileged law professors, unlike us undergraduates, where if we miss for more than 30 seconds, there's a line of undergraduates. I will for always be upset with Indiana Jones for being able to ditch out of his window and just not grade for a year. So, I thought the first thing we would start with this week, Ken, is the unusual circumstances. And I think probably not just that, but an honest question about kind of the White House and presidential drama when it became apparent that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was hospitalized. Now, for what we now know, it was actually a complication related to the treatment of his prostate cancer, but he didn't tell that to either senior administration officials or even his own deputy. So here's the timeline for listeners, because this was a little bit confusing as the week went on. On January 1, Lloyd Austin was rushed to Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in Virginia by ambulance. And the official reason from the press secretary, which is Pat Ryder, was complications from a minor elective procedure earlier in December, on December 22nd. But that was in fact a lie. Doctors from Walter Reed then later, after a lot of explaining, said that he had been diagnosed with prostate cancer and had underwent a successful surgery on December 22nd. After that, he had returned home and had a urinary tract infection and then serious intestinal complications as a result. And so he was then, as I'd mentioned before, rushed back to the hospital. But then this again was only after repeated questioning. What we also now know is that after being admitted on January 2nd, he had to be transferred to the intensive care unit because he had fluid collection going on. So this, though, then came with assurances that he had, quote, never lost consciousness and never underwent general anesthesia, end quote. And that's important because there are rules about this. Now, this is a far cry from the Pentagon's, and I said it a second ago, I'll say it again, lie that it's a, quote, minor elective procedure. Making it even harder, and this is what makes it complicated for President Biden, is that the White House didn't learn about his condition until 3 days after he was hospitalized. And Joe Biden was only made aware of the prostate cancer diagnosis this past Tuesday, according to NSC spokesperson John Kirby. Now, meanwhile, while he was under for the procedure on December 22nd, his authority was given to his Deputy Defense Secretary, Kathleen Hicks, who was also not informed what was happening and was therefore on vacation in Puerto Rico. Now, what even gets crazier is that despite the fact he is in the ICU, Ryder is now saying that, quote, he is in contact with his senior staff and has full access to require secure communication capabilities, end quote, and goes on to say that he continues to, quote, make important decisions about national security and defense, end quote. So what about this process and what about Ryder's lie? Well, in his own defense, he says, quote, it was deeply personal. And so again, we'll continue to work hard to make sure we are being as transparent as possible moving forward. And again, wish the secretary a speedy recovery, end quote. So ABC News senior White House correspondents asked if this signaled a lack of trust between the White House and the Pentagon. And the White House has continued to deny that, just saying that there hasn't been a loss of trust. As a matter of fact, she went on to say, quote, we have complete confidence in the secretary. That is something we have said. The president has complete confidence in the secretary, end quote. Now, of course, Congress has had a response to this as well, although it's been surprisingly a little bit more partisan than I would have imagined, with Republicans seeing this as much a big breakdown and Democrats saying, look, it's a private matter and we need to back away. So Ken, this does, I think, leave some questions, and I understand that Biden doesn't want at this moment to make things. But I can't imagine if I was President Biden, I think angry might be an underscore, especially given the time of the year of what's going on. What was kind of your takeaway? Because again, I see this as being one of those Newstonian moments where, the president is getting a little bit undermined by his own staff.
Well, I don't. I guess I'll fulfill your expectation by giving what you described as the partisan response. So So I don't think it's. I do. We don't know what's being said between President Biden and Secretary Austin, non-publicly, and it may well be that President Biden was pretty angered and alarmed about this, but just decided not to air that publicly. And I think it's a certainty that it's not going to happen again. I don't think there's any risk whatsoever that if Secretary Austin or any other cabinet secretary goes back in for another non-elective emergency medical procedure where they won't be physically capable of doing their job duties, that they're going to fail to notify the president. And I think this, the explosion of this out into the media pretty much is a completely effective prophylactic against that happening in the future. So the way I look at it, given that, is that the Republicans in Congress have been trying to shove Secretary Austin out since long before this episode, and so this is just really playing into it's just one more tool that they've seized on that they want to use to try to deny President Biden his own choice of cabinet secretaries. And I admire him quite a bit for just minimizing it publicly and making it absolutely clear he's standing by Secretary Austin, and he'll pay no attention to a firestorm from a partisan Congress that's just kind of looking to claim some scalps.
Now, I get, I even said I understand Biden standing by Austin. However, I think the problem is in this particular instance, right? So the way you kind of play that out is I think that is the earlier narrative on Austin. But I think in this case, when the average person reads the story who's going to a job and having things going on, I think they see themselves getting fired under similar circumstances. And so as a result, I don't think it plays the same way. And I honestly think that it is kind of a black eye for him in the sense of, it doesn't mean even if you're working at McDonald's, you're gonna let your supervisor know when you're taking your elective time off. That's one thing. Otherwise, the assumption is you're on. And in a more highly environment like this, like so, for example, if I have, right? I mean, I've had immediate procedures, known about procedures. People have to come in and step in for you. So you need to let them know if to the extent and what they're doing. And so him not letting Hicks know what was going on. I mean, I think the average professional person looks at that and goes, wow, I couldn't get away with that. That's kind of terrible. And again, your title isn't, professor or the guy who works at McDonald's. You're the deputy defense secretary. So I don't disagree with you that Republicans are capitalizing on this. Fair. However, I think unlike earlier times, I think there is, in fact, a grain of problematic nature here to which it will benefit Republicans in a real way.
So you talked, I think, both substantively and then politically. So I'll try to address both. Substantively, it was not good, right? I mean, in fact, you compared it to other jobs, but I'd probably even go a step farther than you did and say, in this particular job, it's probably more important than in most other jobs that that there be somebody able to perform that role, because under the controlling statutes, I think the main one is called the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986. The military chain of command has to go from the president through the Secretary of Defense and then down to the combatant commanders. So even though I think Austin did notify the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the military chain of command can't run from the president to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It has to run through a civil official. So I do think it was substantively problematic. I don't argue with that, but I think if you look about so what's to be done about it? Well, it doesn't. Firing Austin and putting somebody else in there, I think would have zero impact on how likely or unlikely this would be to happen again in the future.
And I want to be clear. I was not suggesting that is the direction to go. So continue. I was not arguing for his ouster.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah. Because I think even if he were fired and someone else was put in, and that person would certainly do this, I think it's also true that Austin will never again do this. That he got the message here that he should have designated not only designated Deputy Secretary Hicks, which actually he did do, but also told her that, which is what he didn't do. Right. So he did actually turn his powers over to her on January 2nd. It's just that she didn't find that out until January 4th. Right. So she didn't know that he'd done that. And it would, so that, yeah, he didn't do what he should have done. And it did cause potential serious problem with the chain of command. But I still think that, President Biden, I'm sure, expressed his disappointment to Secretary Austin privately. But I think he's really right to just basically ignore all the noise, because if he's not going to fire him, which I think he shouldn't do, then I don't know what else he should be doing publicly.
No, I think really the only other thing he could have done, and I probably not, but I would say through, as he's been doing at this juncture through his spokesperson, is just to say, hey, we recognize this was a lapse. I think that's really the only thing that's missing here, is that portion of it, just to say, yes, a problem occurred, but not a problem to the level that we need to replace this individual, and put that in context. I think that was really the only missing piece to what has been the White House's response.
Yeah, well, I would agree with that if we had a different Congress. But I think that certainly the White House should not have told lies, and Secretary Austin should not have told lies. So I'll totally agree with you there. But in terms of whether they should have,
the White House wasn't, but you had the Pentagon. It was the Pentagon. It was the Pentagon who was the spokesperson.
Nobody should have told any lies about this. But in terms of whether there should be an apology, I think that would be the right way to go if you had a Congress that was in good faith to apologize to. But I think this House of Representatives is in such bad faith here that I think it just doesn't benefit the country for the president to even acknowledge it when they yell and scream about things, because they're usually not right, and that won't stop them from yelling and screaming about everything. And I think an apology would tend to vindicate if they could get apologies 1/10 of the time they yell and scream about nothing, it's just going to encourage them to do that even more. So I think because of that, and only because of that, I don't agree that an apology would be warranted.
This leads us then to maybe kind of the footnote on this story, Ken, and that is, of course, that yesterday, as a result of that set of potential substantive issues, Inspector General Robert Storch has said that there is going to be an investigation into this and a report to the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Although that scope could be broadened. So given that there is going to be this internal side, what do you think about that? I mean, that's a pretty quick turnaround on that front. Of course, we don't know exactly what that's going to look like. I mean, this is day one of it being announced.
Yeah, I think that is appropriate. I think the Inspector General should investigate. I did say substantively, I think this seems like there were failures to comply with procedure. There were lies that were told, and there was a potential threat to the chain of command. So I absolutely think the Inspector General should investigate. I think the Inspector General is going to do a fair and balanced investigation and publish a report that I would probably be inclined, having not seen it yet, to give to credit. But I think that's totally different than the House of Representatives.
I hear that. So again, I think we can probably leave that behind and move to really a constellation of stories. We keep seeming to get the weeks where we have a lot of things happening on Israel, and this week is no. And so I'm going to try to kind of put together a number of things that are part of a constellation of issues. So this past week, facing accusations of genocide against Palestinians in Gaza, Israel is preparing to defend itself at the United Nations top court, that's the ICJ, in a high-profile legal battle that is coming in the aftermath, of course, of the terrorist attacks from Hamas. Now, the charge, or those who are presenting it at the ICJ, is a little bit different than your traditional court in some ways, is led by South Africa, that has long been a staunch critic of Israel. and has filed this case to be heard. And it's actually occurring, the starting of it, right as we are recording the show on Friday. The South African memo, that's kind of the legal filing in this or the application is what it's actually called for the ICJ. It's an 84-page filing. And really what it's going through is what they argue is the killing, injuring, and purposeful displacing of Palestinian civilians in their argument since October 7th. Now, that's also worth thinking about because, recall, October 7th was the day of the attack. It goes on to argue that denying them food, water, and other essentials is, quote, intended to bring about the destruction of a substantial part of the Palestinian national, racial, and ethnic group, end quote. Now, for members who might not know, the ICJ, or the International Court of Justice, is composed of 15 judges, and its rulings are binding to countries under their jurisdiction. In other words, they create international law. Now, it is also important to note that the United States has pulled out of the treaties that comprise the ICJ, meaning that we do not recognize the ICJ or its decisions, although there is still a bit of what you might think of as a constructivist narrative battle for its decisions when it comes to the United States. Israeli governmental spokesperson Elon Levy said last week that South Africa was, quote, criminally complicit and had openly aligned itself with the Hamas rapist regime, end quote. He also dismissed the filings as, quote, as a nothing more than an atrocious and preposterous that it would be accused of genocide. Now, something that is also interesting as a result of the United States not being part of the ICJ, also this week, dozens of legal and civil organizations from around the world have brought their weight in amicus curiae briefs behind a lawsuit Palestinian Americans accusing President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, along with Lloyd Austin, of failing to, quote, prevent an unfolding genocide in Gaza. In late December, 77 groups, including lots of individuals, added on to that. And what that Palestinian human rights organization and residents of Gaza are arguing is that Biden has had opportunities to stop Israel's ongoing assault and has not. And this is breaking, quote, long and widely held norms of international law, including the Geneva Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the wake of World War II. Now, of course, that is happening in federal district court. So we've got both of these going on. And at the same time, of course, this past week was Blinken's Israel trip to try to get to a sense of what the end game of the violence is. So that is a lot. I have put a lot on your plate. So start where you will, but maybe start, if you can, maybe start with your thoughts on the ICJ's court. Maybe we start there.
Yeah, well, I don't know enough about internal procedure at the ICJ to know how once South Africa filed this complaint for the process to move forward. So I really don't actually know whether the process is moving forward just simply because they filed the complaint, or whether there was some kind of vetting before the process could move forward. But
well, that's actually a good point. I can actually kind of outline quickly for listeners the ICJ process. So you have applicants and respondents in the ICJ process, and to be an applicant, you actually have to. It's not exactly the best kind of analogy for American listeners is we don't have kind of the rule of four or that the writ of certiorari kind of, but there is kind of a stage like that to allow a state to get a hearing before the ICJ. And so what's happening is the first oral portion of that, which will then lead to a written response, which will come months later from Israel.
So if I understand what you just said correctly, correct me if I didn't get it right, the mere fact that South Africa filed this complaint is what triggered the present proceeding.
It triggers it, but then to get it to Thursday, you have to have not all, but some of those justices saying, yes, it can move forward.
And that hasn't happened yet.
That did. That's why we had, that's why today you have what's happening.
Okay, so some justices did decide to let it move forward.
But again, like I was saying, is you got to be careful. It's similar in the sense to that, like the writ of cert phase for the Supreme Court, in that doesn't mean you know how anybody's going to rule, but you've had enough justices say yes, we'll take it effectively.
Yeah, I think that's really disappointing because it is. I think obvious that if you take even the most damning reports against Israel that have been reported in the news to be true, it can't possibly fit the Genocide Convention definition of genocide. And so I'm not really sure why any of the justices at the ICJ would vote to allow a complaint like that to go forward. And it does, I kind of, I in the past would have thought that the U.S. actually should join the ICJ, which the U.S. has never done. And every U.S. government has always said we don't want to join it, because it's not really a legitimate legal tribunal. It's just political. And I didn't really believe that before, but this seems to be, some evidence that seems to me to vindicate that. And I would like to just explain that a little bit, why I think that's so obvious, because the Genocide Convention, it lists kind of four kinds of things that could be genocide, and then lists some things that aren't genocide. And for something to be genocide, it has to be that a nation has taken an act committed with an intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, and then there's various methods listed for how that can be done. But I guess I don't know even what the people of Gaza, I don't know how they could fit any of those categories. The people of Gaza are not a religious group. They may be Muslim, but there's lots of Muslims who aren't in Gaza that the present conflict in Gaza is not affecting. Nobody would be saying that Israel's trying to commit genocide against Muslims generally. The people in Gaza, I don't think, would qualify as a racial group. I suppose they're Arabs, but there's lots of Arabs not in Gaza. And I don't think anybody's saying that Israel's trying to go after any of them. They're an ethnic group. Again, I don't know how you really draw the line between racial or ethnic with respect to Palestinian Arabs. Maybe national would be just Palestinians. But of course, not only are there also Palestinians in the West Bank, but in Israel proper, in the main part of Israel, not the occupied territory, 20% of the whole population is Palestinian, and that's actually more Palestinians than there are in Gaza, and the Palestinians who are in Israel are not in any way being targeted because they're Palestinian. In fact, most of the Palestinians in Israel seem to be broadly sympathetic to Israel's role in this war, at least maybe not as much as the Jewish people in Israel are, but they're not supporting Hamas in any way. And so I think just looking at who the group is, there's nothing there. The people of Gaza couldn't rise to the level of a national, an ethnic, or racial, or religious group, and nobody is arguing that Israel is actually trying to destroy, in whole or in part, all Muslims or all Arabs or all Palestinians. So I think right there it just kind of falls down.
So I think one of the key elements, and again, I want to be clear, this is one where I think we have a lot of agreement, but as you read the documents, as you read the filing, I think a lot of it is on the civilian overall displacement, and two, not allowing there to be food, water, etc. for non-combatants. And that seems to be a big portion of that. But,
yeah.
but again, that, as you outlined there, is not genocide. That could potentially be other types of war crimes. But
yeah. Let me say something about displacement, because I mainly focused on the fact that there's nobody's got any bona fide way to argue that Israel is targeting any group that could count as a national group, an ethnic group, a racial group, or a religious group. But also displacement is actually specifically mentioned in the Genocide Convention as not being genocide. Right? It's specifically accepted. So made an exception, I mean to say. So the idea that that movement of people is possibly being forced here. And there's some factual debate about that. I know there are some statements from some minority ministers in the Israeli government that do suggest that at least their goal is to displace people. So I get that there's some basis for that. But displacement of people or forced movement of people is not genocide, except in one very limited circumstance, which I think nobody has alleged has happened, which is forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So, if they were taking Palestinian children and, bringing them to be raised as Jews in Israeli families, that would be the one kind of forced movement of people that could qualify within the definition of genocide under the Genocide Convention. But I don't think anyone has alleged that that's happened even once. So, just moving people around, within Palestine or within Gaza, or even if there is a plot to try to get some of them to leave Gaza, that would all be within a specific exception in the Genocide Convention that can't be counted as genocide.
Well, I want to continue to talk about that too, but I also want to then bring us to the domestic case, which again, I say obviously from the point of view of a presidential scholar, and I'm sure that you're going to agree on legal grounds. There is no case law that suggests that you can sue the president failing to uphold the particular policies that you'd like to have him be. But the fact that it has gotten this many groups attaching amicus curiae briefs, which, by the way, when you're studying this for for listeners, that's oftentimes a way to kind of see and understand public opinion. It does have a lot of public opinion backing, or what you would think of as being a relatively baseless legal case, which again brings us to the question of, why do we continue to kind of call this genocide? And so what are your thoughts on that front in light of the federal district court case, Ken?
Yeah, I don't want to shift. I want to just say one more thing about the ICJ case. And
I'm not done with that either, so that's fair. That's fair. I was just trying to bring them together a little bit. Yeah.
The other thing on forced transfer that I forgot to say, which is just extremely ironic about this ICJ case, is that Hamas literally has in its platform, and Hamas is the governing party in Gaza. It's literally in its platform that the Palestinian state should go from the river to the sea, and that all Jews in Israel should be expelled. Right. So they are literally calling for that unequivocally, whereas this case is actually about, settling a factual dispute about whether the minority ministers in the Israeli government, are expressing Israeli policy, or whether the Israeli policy is actually not forced relocation. It's arguable what the Israeli policy is. It's not even arguable what the Hamas policy is. The Hamas policy is absolutely forced relocation or murder of every Jew in Israel.
You say, I agree. And yet at the same time, right now, we still have a non-significant portion of the House of Representatives arguing that statement and that goal is peaceful.
Yeah, well, it's not peaceful in the Hamas platform, and that's why
it's not peaceful in any platform.
You and I agree with that. We talked about that in the previous.
Yes, and I'm bringing that back here because again, you say that, and I say that in the point that I agree. But a minute ago we're kind of talking. But and it's not just a few. We have a large portion of Democratic House members. As a matter of fact, it's two of theirs pinned tweets right now. I was looking at it yesterday, which was, quoting Hamas. It blows my mind.
I think there are Americans who use that phrase with a different connotation than Hamas uses it. We talked about this on a previous episode.
I hear that. And we didn't go into this last time, but as that continues to be pinned there, I was really bothered yesterday by that because I hear that. However, it starts to feel a little bit like the neo-Nazi trying to tell me that what he means by his salute, is different. And at some point I'm like, listen, maybe that could be true, but it increasingly becomes less likely to me the longer that gets, that's its meaning and you continue. Does that make sense? Right? I start to lose. I want to give you that benefit of the doubt, but I start to lose the ability to do that at some point.
Yeah, I'm not going to argue with you about that. I think you're basically right about that. I think that I would just, maybe say some Americans are really, misled, not so much that they themselves are calling for the death or expulsion of all Jews, but that they believe that it could be possible to have a Palestinian state in the whole geographic territory of Israel, where there's a Palestinian government and a Palestinian majority, and Jews would still be able to live there and still have civil rights there. But that's definitely not what Hamas is calling for, and they're very clear about that. Yeah, and so I think it is amazing to me that is Israel, where their government officially asserts that their policy is still in favor of a two-state solution and still not in favor of expelling any Palestinians from Gaza or the West Bank. And, I know there's a factual question about whether they're telling the truth about that or not. But my point was just that Hamas doesn't even make any bones about it. The policy that they are saying is genocidal is their policy. Like, it's the policy that they openly espouse is to expel or murder every Jew in Israel.
Yeah, I mean,
So, okay.
and again, to bring this back, because this goes in, the argument from the domestic case says this. This is from their kin, and they're kind of striking straight at your argument. They say, look, under the summary of their argument, characterized as the crime of crimes, genocide is, quote, the denial of the right of existence to entire human groups, a denial which shocks the conscience of mankind and results in great losses to humanity, end quote. Which is quoting an ICJ opinion. Genocide is seeking to, quote, destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, such as see the Convention on Genocide, Article 2. So, I mean, they're coming straight at your argument and saying, in fact, the ICJ has ruled in such a way that it would include Palestinians. And again, this is the domestic case we're talking about here. This is the amicus curiae in federal district court, and therefore arguing that not preventing these atrocities is a failure on President Biden.
Well, I mean, again, Palestinians as an ethnic or national group, Israel is protecting the Palestinians who are in Israel against attacks from Hamas. Some of the people that were killed and kidnapped on October 7th in Israel were in fact Palestinian people. They weren't all Jewish people, and so Israel's certainly not targeting Palestinians by their ethnicity or their race for anything. But the other claim, I guess, would be that to the extent that there's a war going on now, which Hamas started between Gaza, which they claim as an independent Palestinian state, and Israel, which they claim as a foreign country, and there's a war. Certainly, there are some international laws of war that would require combatants to try to minimize harm to civilians. I would say Israel seems to me to be doing a better job of that than most combatants in most wars have done. I'm not sure that when the U.S. was waging the war in Iraq or in Afghanistan, that we were allowing third-party countries to come in and give food and medicine aid and clothing aid to the very people that we were targeting. And Israel has done a lot of that. Israel, I think, has been contacting other Arab countries about whether they would step up their financial support. I think that's primarily in the West Bank now more than in Gaza, but Palestinians in the West Bank have been economically very negatively impacted by the war because 100,000 of them used to work every day in Israel, and they can't do that anymore. So the economy in the West Bank is falling apart. And I think in order to help the people who live there, the Israeli government has been going to Arab states and trying to get them to donate more charitable money into the West Bank to benefit the Palestinians who live there. And so I think it's been, every war is going to have a collateral impact on civilians. 20,000 civilians, or 23 or 4,000 as it might be now, that is a lot. But I think most of the other wars that are taking place around the Arab world and in Africa, that Israel's not involved in, have claimed similar or higher number of civilian casualties, at least as a percentage of the populations affected. So I don't really see anything different about this than what you'd see in any other war. I also could address your separate question about the jurisdiction of courts, but I didn't know if you wanted to say anything more about that. Yeah.
Well, let's talk overall before we get to kind of that court jurisdiction. And here's maybe another broad question on this front, because you were setting it up this way. And this is something that I have been thinking about carefully since October. One of the things I think at a fundamental philosophic level that really, at least in the United States, and I would say more broadly, defines differences between the left and the right has been the idea of the appropriateness and the ability to use and wield violence, specifically in terms of war and state conflict. And I would say that generally speaking, on the kind of the historic idea is that there can be better or worse, justified or unjustified wars philosophically, morally. But it seems that in the post-Vietnam era, that especially the left in the United States has increasingly taken the view that all conflict is in and of itself moral, and ergo you can't have justified war. And I was thinking back about this in terms of in the wake of 9/11, I remember there was a non-significant, immediately there was kind of this, everybody was on the same page for a little bit. But then it wasn't too much longer after that. You had some critiques of the left. This is pre going into Iraq of why did we invade Afghanistan? And for all of the conversation you could about how we handled the aftermath of Afghanistan, it was hard not to go, that's the question you have? Like, that seemed like a pretty just war conflict to me. And this, too, seems like one of those. And so I guess one of the questions that I'm kind of here lingering as I look at the number of individuals who are filing against Israel and the circumstances that occurred here, is there a philosophic space left on the left or just war? Because it seems from my point of view, the answer is no. And they're always going to side against state-backed conflict, which is weird for me as a libertarian-leaning guy who's like, look, this is really the only place the state ought to have, right? That's what if there's any place I think they have a role, it's right here.
Yeah, I don't look at that on the left-right axis the way you are. I think it has more to do with who the combatants are and what the issues are. I think even right now today in America, the left is more likely to support providing continued military support to Ukraine than the right is. And to the extent that there's been a falling off in support for that war, it's because it's from the right. It's from the Trump wing of the Republican Party. So I think if we talk about September 11th, I think there was very broad bipartisan support. And of course, there was a near unanimous vote. I think only one or two no votes in the entire House of Representatives for the authorization for the use of force to retaliate against, I guess it was Al-Qaeda, didn't name a particular country. But I think the reason that started fading, and I think you're right to think it started fading relatively soon, but I don't think that's because of the left getting queasy about the use of military force as much as it was that the left was getting suspicious that the Bush administration was really trying to expand that mandate. And I think those suspicions were, borne out by the Iraq War, which was, something that, again, it wasn't that the left was opposed to the use of just military force. It was that the left saw no justice in the idea of going to war against Iraq, which had nothing to do with September 11th. But yet the Bush administration seemed to be trying to conflate the two. So I think that's where the erosion of support came from. So, and again, even now with Israel, I think, to the extent that I think you're right to think that the left is less supportive of the Israeli military efforts, but I don't think that's because they're less supportive of military efforts generally. I think it's just because the left, for reasons that I disagree with, are more supportive of the Palestinians and less supportive of Israel. But I think Ukraine really does provide an immediate present counterexample on your left-right axis there.
I hear that. And so, I had thought about that a little bit myself. And so I dug just a little bit into some of the data. And when you take a look at voters themselves, and you slice them up by party and you slice them up by age, what you see is, in general, you're right, right? So right now, 48% of Republicans argue that we're giving too much aid to Ukraine. But then when you look over at the Israeli side, though, nearly 70% of Democrats in that same bracket are arguing that we're supporting Israel too much. So there is, in fact, a divide. And you're right. I mean, that's obviously a swap. But there is a non-significant, you might say in like a stats form, it's a much larger magnitude, it appears to be, when you're talking about the Democratic response to that than in the so even as the Republicans have waned their support, they're still not down to the level of disapproval the Democrats have had for Israel. Does that make sense? What I'm trying to
I hear. I mean, I could succinctly summarize it by saying you're saying that Democrats are more likely to oppose U.S. military involvement on behalf of Israel. Than Republicans are to oppose it in Ukraine. But I just think that's because of how Democrats and Republicans respectively feel about the substance of those conflicts. More than how they feel about war generally. In fact, I think a big part of the way that Trump was able to take over the Republican Party and, shove, particularly Jeb Bush aside in 2016, when Bush was originally seen as the major, most likely Republican nominee, although he never got above 5%.
I was going to say.
But I mean, when he first put his name.
Mike Kasich got better than that. I'm just saying, give him some credit. Give me.
But what I was going to try to say is that Trump, was able successfully to tie Jeb Bush to George W. Bush, and was able to really, make that brand poisonous, but because of the Iraq War, right? Now, maybe also because of some other things like Hurricane Katrina, but I think
I hear that. And I don't want to stop you, but I do want to. I have a slightly different take. I think it was more the long-standing, continued presence in Afghanistan rather than the Iraq War, although that is what he was talking about. Because if you think about the demographic of people who was most likely to have their kids or people they knew in it, it was that demographic of people. In other words, I think you're making an intellectual connection there. I think it was connected more to that ongoing, we have people fighting and they don't.
Yeah. Well, right. Same.
Which is, again, ironic since it's Trump.
It doesn't affect my point that much, because my real point is that when Trump was pushing an anti-war platform, that appealed to a lot of Republicans.
Okay.
Right. So that's really what I was saying. So you were sort of, I think, positing that Republicans are hawks and Democrats are doves. And I'm just not sure that I buy that. I think it really just depends a lot on what the issue is that American military force would be used in favor of. When President Clinton, committed U.S. military force in Bosnia and in Somalia, most of the support for that came from Democrats. Republicans were pretty uniformly opposed to Somalia and pretty split on Bosnia. I know that's already 25 years ago, but I just think we've tended to see different presidents having different ideas about what would be a just use of military force, and that there's some partisan differences about that. But I tend to think most parties, most voters are willing to support the judgments of their own presidents, and for some time, and then get tired of continued conflict if it's not seeming to accomplish anything over a longer period of time.
Okay, so more of a traditional war weariness.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we should pause on that, as big as it is, and get into some theater. No, we're not. We're not going to do a movie review, or sort of. Instead, I thought maybe we might talk at least a little bit about two competing theaters. Of course, on Wednesday, the House was the House committee was looking into having their kind of I shouldn't say they're looking into it. That's giving it too much credit. They were having their publicity stunt of it's time to convict, or I should say, find Hunter Biden in contempt of Congress. And again, we had talked about this before, Ken, and we came down a little bit different places, right? I thought they ought to do this. I thought they could have done it better, but okay, it's the House. It's all about media anymore. I get that. But what became a little bit of an even more over the top is that Hunter Biden, who is now facing 3 felonies and 6 misdemeanors for his $1.4 million in federal income tax on Thursday, decided to just drop by on Wednesday the Oversight Committee hearing on his contempt charge. As a matter of fact, when noticing he'd entered, Representative Nancy Mace asked, quote, "Who bribed Hunter Biden to be here today?" Which I have to be honest, I mean, she's got a terrible, but that was a great buy. Like that was a great shot. But this then led to this kind of really unruly confrontation between Mace and Democrats, with Democrats, I think, rightfully also trying to get a jab in, saying, like, let's just hear from him right now. Like, here he is. Meanwhile, others calling him a coward. So, I mean, it was a really great made-for-TV moment, which is, I suppose, what a lot of what the House does in general is. I mean, I'm a scholar. That's what we've already come to that point of view, although it is always funny when it becomes quite that big. And it was also probably kind of a high-risk strategy, I think, for Hunter Biden, because he knew the following day, i.e. on Thursday, that he would be heading over and pleading not guilty in Los Angeles to those 3 felonies and those 6 misdemeanors. And as we've already talked about, accused of stiffing the government in the years 2016 through 2019 and spending the money, in the words of the document, quote, on drugs, escorts and girlfriends, luxury hotels, rental properties, exotic cars, clothing, and other items of personal nature. In short, everything but his taxes, end quote, according to the indictment. Which I had to include that line because that, like, you don't oftentimes get funny indictment lines, but I liked that one. So I feel bad. I'm going to be honest. I feel like this is the I feel bad for President Biden week. Again, I felt bad for him over the Lloyd thing. I feel bad for him in this. I get what Hunter Biden is trying to do. He is trying to win in the media space. He is trying. He was trying yesterday to have a great bit of a media bump. He wanted a soundbite. He wanted a cool TikTok video. He wanted that moment. And I know it sounds. I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean that in an empirical way. I'm not trying to say. I'm not throwing anything at him negatively necessarily. That just is what it is. And I get that. But I also see this as being kind of a high-risk strategy because I don't know what either he or President Biden gains from these moments. But I think that President Biden has a lot to lose from these moments. I see no win and I see a lot of loss. But I do see a lot of potential win for Republicans, right? I mean, it gives Representative Mace a great time to make him look like a spoiled jerk in a way that he wouldn't have gotten. But I get what he was going for, and I get that could have been the way it came off. But instead, you just get this big bunch of spectacle, in my opinion. And it also comes off weird since you know the next day is when he's going to be pleading not guilty. And so once again, he's bouncing from one coast to the other coast for seemingly the spectacle of it. So what do you think about this in this case? Again, I just feeling bad for President Biden.
No, I actually don't agree with that. I think there was a political benefit both to Hunter Biden and to Joe Biden in Hunter showing up because, Hunter is probably going to be voted in contempt of Congress, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so I think there needs to be a counter narrative about, what that was all about, right? And if he was subpoenaed and he just wouldn't show up, then that's contempt of Congress. And so I don't think it's easy to have a counter narrative there. Whereas, by showing up and making kind of the strong move, I'm right here. I'm ready to testify. The only thing I don't want to do is testify behind closed doors and have people mischaracterize what I say. So I want all this to be right out in public so people can see that I've got nothing to hide and this is a kangaroo proceeding. I think it allows him to establish that narrative as an explanation of what the contempt vote was all about, that the contempt vote is just, illegitimate, politically illegitimate because he was perfectly willing to testify. And I think that's a better narrative for him than just slinking away, which would have been the alternative, I guess.
Here's the problem, though. It is almost certain that he is going to be found guilty on some, if not many, of these charges. And so what that then becomes is, if you know that going in, which I think, given that he was willing to make a plea deal, means he does, earlier, and then that fell apart. What that means is that moment, especially if it comes before the presidential election, plays into the narrative. It doesn't make the narrative that you're suggesting anymore, and it makes the narrative of the guilty guy who is making a power play.
No, I don't think there's I mean, that may look like that to Republicans who already aren't going to vote for Joe Biden. But
what I'm saying is I think that's what it looks like to those voters who are going to determine this election in states like Pennsylvania.
Well, but what the Republican House presumably wanted to ask Hunter Biden about is Joe Biden's connection to any of this conduct. Joe Biden doesn't have a connection to any of this conduct, and so
I get that. I'm not trying. I'm here. I'm not trying to suggest that the narrative there you're straightening is not true. What I'm suggesting is if you know in advance as a media strategy that you're going to lose on some of these counts. And if you think you're going to lose on those counts before the election, that making that bid isn't going to, even if we can peer in everybody's mind and recognize all it's about is just complete kangaroo-ness, and I grant that, I still think that makes terrible campaign ads moving forward if you know, and I think you probably do if you're willing to take the plea deal, that you're going to lose on some of these counts. So my point wasn't that, hey, that narrative couldn't work, but in the long run for the presidential election, it doesn't work if he loses on some of those counts. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, I think what you're missing is I don't know whether he's going to win or lose. I think the criminal cases could go either way, but let's assume he loses and gets convicted on some of those counts, like you say.
Yeah.
The fact that those cases are going to happen in criminal courts and not in the House of Representatives absolutely assures that Joe Biden is not going to be tarnished in any way, because Joe Biden had nothing to do with anything that happened. So if Hunter Biden gets convicted of, he kept a gun while he was addicted to drugs, and that's illegal, and he gets convicted of that. There's no way to cast any doubt on Joe Biden's fitness to be president based on something his son did that had absolutely nothing to do with Joe Biden. And so,
you've looked at American elections before, right? I hear you, but so again, you're arguing that like a lawyer, and more power to you, right?
Jimmy Carter had Billy Carter, Bill Clinton had Roger Clinton, Nixon had a ne'er-do-well brother.
Careful on Carter. He only served one term.
That's true, but he got elected. Billy Carter was an issue even in the '76 election, and I think there's
Billy Beer.
Even what George W. Bush got reelected, and one of his daughters was apparently had alcohol problems while she was still in college, and I think that's just kind of normal stuff, and the Republicans are trying to blow it up, but what they're really trying to do is link it to Joe Biden, and nothing in the criminal cases. That's not even going to come up in the criminal case. There's nothing that could relate to Joe Biden that would even be relevant enough to be admitted into a criminal case. So I think that's really different than what a House of Representatives proceeding would have looked like.
If Joe Biden, if Hunter Biden had been having his obvious struggles and issues in the way that Jenna had been, but had not been on the boards of companies and been making money through companies, I don't even think Republicans would be attempting to have have the narrative that they have today. I think what makes Hunter Biden unique from now, probably not Billy, because Billy did try to cash in on it. But man, he's just, I don't even know if we can compare it, but I think Jenna's a better example. Jenna Bush was at no point also seemingly attempting to make millions of dollars while she's in.
But the Trump children all did, and in fact, Jared Kushner made billions, not millions, of dollars off of his father-in-law's presidency. So, I just don't see.
I didn't disagree with. I don't agree that he didn't do that. And I think the Democrats pointed that out frequently and often.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we'll see how this plays out politically, but I think the most important political, benefit of the theater that we saw yesterday for Hunter Biden actually showing up is that I really think the kinds of issues that you're talking about will not be of concern to Democratic voters, and whereas it might have been of more concern to Democratic voters if it really looked like Hunter Biden was just running away and hiding.
Okay, well, we'll have to continue to take a look at that as the presidential season moves forward and see if we can try to figure out the winners or losers. Although you've got a good track record, Ken, so I should be careful of going up against you on this one. But okay, so I think we need to get in one more story, because if we're going to have, you can't talk about kangaroo weird moments in courts and or House members if we don't talk about, well, Thursday and the Trump case, right? You got to do this. So earlier this week, Ken, Trump had asked Speak own closing arguments. And it is hard to overstate how weird that is. And I'm going to let you explain that a little bit more to listeners in a minute. I'll just say it's really weird. Trump lawyer Chris Kiss had requested permission from the judge for Trump to participate in the case closing arguments. And Gauguin said he would allow Trump to speak only if the former president agreed to abide by a long list of conditions, including and importantly limiting his remarks to the issues in the case and refraining from giving, quote, a campaign speech, end quote. After Kiss failed to accept the conditions, the judge wrote in an email on Wednesday that he assumed Trump wouldn't be speaking during the presentations. But on Thursday, Trump did end up getting the last word in. After Kiss and his lawyers had finished presenting their closing arguments, Kiss said Trump that wanted to participate. Erdogan asked Trump on the spot, which is already bizarre, to agree to limit his remarks to the evidence and the law, saying, quote, do you promise to just comment on the law and the facts and not go outside of it, end quote. Trump neither agreed nor disagreed, but began by retorting, quote, well, I think this case goes outside of the law and facts, end quote. He went on into what you might call his typical criticisms of the campaign trail, calling it, quote, a political witch hunt, end quote, and going on to rile against the judge itself. Trump would say, when you say don't go out of these things, we have a situation where I'm an innocent man. I've been persecuted by someone running for office. And he's referring, of course, to James. This is a fraud on me, Trump would go on to say. What's happened here, sir, is a fraud on me. Finally, the judge warned Trump that he was running up against the deadline for a planned break. Trump then turned his decision on the judge himself and criticized him, saying, quote, you have your own agenda. I certainly understand that. You can't listen for more than 1 minute, end quote. At this, finally, the judge says, Mr. Kiss, please control your client. And they ended the break. Now, what for me is, I'm curious to get your take on this. Again, I have not spent nearly as much time in courtrooms as you have, but I have spent time in courtrooms. I've watched a lot. Never have I heard, seen any kind of instance like this where then the defendant just went on with the rest of their day. And this leads me, I've been thinking about this, Ken. This is kind of the larger, and we're not going to deal with the 14th Amendment because Mike and Jay have already done that. But I think this leads to this larger question. No other defendant would have, I think, been able to interact this way and to have this kind of moment and not have a moment where the judge gavelled him out or potentially put him in jail temporarily. But if he did those things, I don't think he can do those things either. And this brings us to one of the different predictions that we've had, and that is thought that Trump really could face jail time. And I had said, I don't think that's a possibility in the system as it exists today. And the more I've thought about it, and the more I've looked at this particular, again, I recognize it's kind of a kangaroo moment. I think this is evidence in my favor because I don't think the judge could have operated any differently, even if that is what he would have done in every other circumstance, which means I just don't see in the long run how, as Trump runs, he is found guilty of anything. So what do you think about this crazy moment and or that theory?
No, I think, this. I agree this is a data point in favor of your argument, but I think it's a small data point in favor of your argument, not a big one, because this is a civil trial and this is a bench trial. And also we're at the end of it, right? So for all those reasons, I certainly agree with you that it was extremely unlikely and, didn't happen, that this judge would send Trump to jail. But, this is a civil case. It's quite unusual to send someone to jail for contempt during a civil case when there's no jail possibly emanating, even if they lose the civil case. And also, Trump's antics, because there's no jury, it doesn't really taint the proceedings. The judge is perfectly capable of ignoring and disregarding everything. And it happened right at the end. So, I think when the judge decided to let Trump speak for 5 minutes, the judge just probably figured, I'll just bear this I'll bear it for 5 minutes and then he'll, and then we'll be done. And so I think that it would have been a disproportionate to send Trump to jail for contempt under those circumstances, more or less, no matter what he said. So certainly this is a situation where, I think, there wasn't really any chance he was going to go to jail. And that's consistent with your theory that he's not going to go to jail. But I think there's other kinds of situations that, there could, not all those factors might obtain.
Now, I want you to finish that thought, but just in general, because again, this is one, I recognize it. What do you think the likelihood, had somebody else been sitting in the chair, that there would have been a different kind of repercussion? Am I right in at least thinking, I recognize in a civil case that's unusual, but do you think the judge, at the minimum, don't you think a judge would have, I'm asking an honest question, gavelled him out and been like, okay, you're shutting up now?
Well, I actually don't even think it's possible to hypothesize anyone else in that chair because the lawyers wouldn't have even made that request on behalf of a different client.
That's fair.
It's such an improper request, and it's such a detrimental request to the legal interest of the client, and it was detrimental to Trump's legal interest. And you said he's not going to get convicted in any of these cases. Well, this is only a civil case, so the word conviction doesn't apply.
True.
But it's a certainty that he's going to lose, and he's going to get a huge judgment against him. And I think the Attorney General James amended her complaint. She originally asked for a $250 million judgment. She raised it to a $370 million judgment. And I'd be shocked if she gets any less than the $250 million she originally asked for. She may not get the whole amended amount, but that's and that does relate to the way Trump himself decided to conduct the trial, because I think he went into it, deciding that he's already going to lose the case. There's no reason to try to mitigate the damages. His political interest is best served by just trying to make a circus of the whole thing and make it into a bunch of partisan theatrics. And he really, dedicated his efforts to doing that. But you're not going to see a normal litigant doing that. A normal litigant is going to listen to their lawyer a little bit more about, how do you make this case come out in the least bad way for you possible.
Right.
But I think that just wasn't, that wasn't Trump's priority. So I think it would normally be seen as malpractice for a lawyer to even make the request that Christopher Kise made 3 or 4 times, that Judge Engron let Trump address him. But a client who is represented by a competent counsel does not get to participate pro se in a legal closing argument. Counsel makes the legal closing argument. There is often a time in a criminal trial at sentencing where the defendant, after having been convicted,
penalty phase, right?
Yeah, in the penalty phase, they can address the court, and usually they'll do that to try to apologize or say something mitigating, so that they won't get sentenced as much. They won't usually. I've never heard of anyone using that to try to provoke the court and say that it's a biased proceeding, because that can't really help in terms of the goal of mitigating. But then, other than the opportunity that litigants might get at a penalty phase to address the court and just try to say something by way of explanation or apology, when you get to actual legal closing arguments, if it's a pro se case, then the litigant has to make the closing argument themselves. But in the normal case where the litigant is in fact represented by competent counsel, it's counsel's job to make the argument, and counsel has to operate within the rules of professional responsibility and legal ethics, and under the possible threat of bar suspension or disbarment if they violate those rules. Someone who's not a lawyer, isn't constrained by bar discipline. Trump can't be disbarred because he's not in the bar. But that would be the more usual kind of remedy if a lawyer was making the closing argument and a lawyer pulled such a completely improper stunt like that to try to make a campaign speech in the platform for a legal closing argument. So I think Judge Engoron basically did the right thing in terms of giving Trump his 5 minutes, and once he decided to let him talk, I think he pretty much had to plan to just close his ears and try to duck. But I don't really see why he let him make the argument at all. But maybe he just decided that he'd rather make more rulings in Trump's favor so that there'd be less things for Trump to appeal on
later. Yeah, fair. Well, I guess we probably should stop it there, but I'll just say, Ken, my prediction, and you can kind of add that in if you want. I think James gets the full amount of money, but I think on some bizarre thing we can't even think of now, it gets overturned on appeal.
Where, by the New York Court of Appeals?
Yes.
Oh, that won't happen.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, we'll see.
I want to find out now. I love it.
Yeah, it might get reduced if it's a very high amount of money. It might get reduced. But it won't. It'll still be reduced to a smaller, very high amount of money, I think.
Okay, I'm curious to see. Well, that's it for this week's show. If you're not already a supporter of the Politics Guys, I hope you'll consider becoming one. Without supporters, it would be the end of the show. And so you can become a supporter right now and make this show happen. But it's not just making the show happen, as fun as that is. It is all getting kinds of good stuff, including free versions of everything we put out. So, for example, you get tired of listening to ads. I do. That's why we get the Disney Plus version, right? So if you want to get that, in addition to our supporter exclusive midweek show, that's one of my favorite things. Matter of fact, that's what Ken and I are going to be doing in just a minute. We're going to be releasing our midweek show. We've been going through the Constitution. You'll get our upcoming Constitution on the First Amendment and petition and assembly, but everything we've done thereafter. So it's a chance to kind of break away from the normal deal, but that's only available to supporters. And if you want that plus so much others, it is time to become a member of the Politics Guys. So head to patreon.com/politicsguys and take a look at the different levels of support, pick a level of support, and start getting that midweek show, start getting the ad-free versions of the show, and so much more. If you'd like to support us somewhere else besides patreon.com/politicsguys, we're also on Venmo, where we're at Politics Guys. You can also support the show through PayPal. All of those are available in the show links. Just scroll down right there on your phone, or if you're on a computer, head to politicsguys.com/support. Now, whether you're a supporter or not, we would really appreciate it if you would subscribe, rate, or review us on the podcast app of your choice. And again, sharing these episodes or snippets of them to social media is always something we adore. If you've got a question, comment, correction, or anything else you'd like to share with the Politics Guys, just reach out to us at mail@politicsguys.com. We're also on Facebook and X, and you'll find all of those links, you guessed it, in the show notes. As always, a special thanks to the executive producers of the Politics Guys: Bruce Johnson, Wilma Marino, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new episode next week, and I hope you'll join us then.